Well, we're preaching on the Beatitudes. This is the first time I've ever preached a series on the Beatitudes, doing them all. I've never done that before, so you're the pilot. You're the pilot ones. So here we go. This is a beautiful text, as every beatitude is. A beatitude is a blessing, all right? And this blessing is from Jesus, and this is what he says. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Now, years ago, Albert Einstein was on a train going out of New York City. Albert Einstein, you will recall, was the eminent scientist, philosopher, founded the theory of relativity. He was in his train car, his room there, and he knew that a conductor was coming by to check their tickets. Now, if you know anything about Albert Einstein, you know that he was a bit absent-minded. Story is told that one time he went out of his house and forgot to put his shoes on. He was so absorbed in what he was thinking. So when he checked for his ticket, he could not find it. He searched all his pockets. He looked in his satchel with all his papers. And then he decided to get down on his hands and knees and go about and look for the ticket on the floor, underneath the benches, and so forth. When the conductor came by, he looked in on Dr. Einstein, and there he was on his hands and knees, diligently searching for the ticket, saying it must be here somewhere. And the conductor said, "Oh, Dr. Einstein, don't worry about it. I trust you." And Dr. Einstein said, "This is not a matter of trust. If I don't find that ticket, I don't know where I'm going." And can't we all relate? We've all lost things before. We've all been wondering where we're going at some time or another. We're on the train of life, so to speak. And we do not want to live without purpose. Now, as I looked at that statement, I thought I put this wrongly. Why didn't I put it this way? We want to live with purpose. That's the positive way, isn't it? That would have been better to have said that. But you see, we gravitate so quickly to the negative. It's almost as if there's something in us that doesn't quite believe things can be completely positive. We don't want to live without purpose. We want to live with purpose and meaning. there are lots of biblical words that address the idea of living with purpose, living with something greater than ourselves, a goal that is bigger than we are. Some of these words you're quite familiar with. Salvation is one of them. Salvation is both a destination and a process. Would you agree? So to speak, we get on the gospel train, right? And that's when we say yes to Jesus. He invites us on his train. We get on that gospel train. Then we travel with Jesus, right? And that's the process of sanctification. And then eventually we arrive at a destination, which is the New Jerusalem, heaven, the fulfillment of all of eternal life. We have other words. Salvation, you remember, means wholeness. But we have other words. Here's another one. Holiness. Holiness means to be set apart for God. It is also a process. We are being set apart for God each and every day, but it's also a destination to be holy, to be completely set apart for God so that God can do and act and work through us at God's good pleasure. Godliness is another word. That means to be filled with God. It is both a process and a destination. Of course, there's the one we will deal with today. Righteousness. I think it is also a process and a destination. We need to be right, and one day we'll be fully right. God makes us right, and one day we'll be fully like God sees us as righteous. We have both imputed righteousness and imparted righteousness. Those are big words, aren't they? When God imputes righteousness to you, do you know what that is? It means God sees you as righteous, gives you the gift of righteousness, even though you haven't earned it. So God looks at you and sees the patience of Jesus, sees the love of Jesus in you, the kindness, the gentleness, all those good qualities that Jesus embodies fully. God imputes to us even when we don't deserve it. We get imputed righteousness when we say yes to Jesus. But then we need imparted righteousness. You know what that is? That's when we actually become how God sees us. So it's one thing to be seen as patient. It is another to what? Act like it, right? My wife doesn't want imputed righteousness patience. She wants imparted righteous patience, you know. Ooh, that's a lot to say. You get the idea? She wants me to live patiently, not just to know that Jesus is patient. So there it is. We want to live with purpose. And some of these great words are almost disappearing from the common vocabulary. Would you agree? People do not spend a lot of time these days talking about salvation, godliness, holiness, righteousness. It's almost as if those words are being torn out of our vocabulary, at least in the common sectors. Plus, they have come to be associated with negative things. So salvation has become associated with something like this. One day, and this is a true story, I was in the elevator of a hospital. I like to mind my own business in an elevator. And I am standing there, and someone comes in, the door closes, he looks over at me and says, "Are you saved?" And so I thought I'd have a little fun. And I said, "Really? Saved? What's that mean?" I shouldn't have done that. Because I got the 4 spiritual laws and then some. Finally, after he went through his long dissertation, I said, "I'm a follower of Jesus Christ." And thank you. I believe in salvation. So that was it. But who wants to be cornered in an elevator? Really? Do we want that? Shouldn't salvation come out of relationship? It's not just some formula to put on me, is it? It's something precious. It's not something trivial. It's not some agenda. It is a precious word that means wholeness. I wonder if that guy in the elevator doesn't drive more people away than he attracts. I don't know. I hope not. I hope that God gifts him with the gift of evangelism so he gets a bit of a fruit for his labor. But we get the idea. When we think salvation, what do we think of? Sometimes we think of somebody cornering us with an agenda, coming to our door, knocking, trying to assume that we don't know anything about God and they know everything about God and they want to impart all of that to us. I am all for evangelism, but I don't like the associations. What about you? And then there's other associations with these words. Holiness. Holiness doesn't just mean set apart these days. It means this: I am better than you. Or it means legalism. This is holy. Wear your dress a certain length. Keep your hair a certain way. Those kind of things. Do you know my grandfather was beaten because he wore a short-sleeved shirt on Sunday? That's holiness gone awry, isn't it? And righteousness. Righteousness has come to be associated with self-righteousness. And that's back to I'm better than you. Holier than thou. So we don't want these kind of things, do we? We want righteousness to be in its proper context here in the Scriptures, which means it's a relationship. Righteousness means this: it is all about right relationships. It's a right relationship with God, a right relationship with other people. It is a right relationship with ourselves. It is a right relationship with all the gifts God gives, such as the earth. This is righteousness. You can't have one without the other. We need righteousness with a right relationship with God, this gift that God gives us, and that helps us with all the other relationships. Righteousness is about relationship. It's not about what we do or don't do so much as it is relational. It's not a list of do's and don'ts. Jesus was speaking to people, and they had a problem. They thought righteousness was out of reach. Do you ever think that? It's just out of reach. Do you know how hard it is to raise children? Anybody know that? Yeah. It's difficult to raise kids. I love my children, and I'm so thankful they turned out reasonably well. Okay? It's a miracle because they were all preachers' kids, which is an extra burden to go through life with. You know that, don't you? In fact, my son tried to prove he wasn't a preacher's kid, really. And he was quite good at it. I remember on one vacation, they had just gotten under my skin. And I thought, this is vacation. We should all be happy. And I fled the scene. It's often good to flee the scene. And I fled the scene, and I went outside, and I looked up, and I said, oh, God, when, how long, when will I get it together with my kids? You know? When will I get to the place where I don't lose my temper or get hooked? Have you ever been there? Huh? So, that's a horrible place to be. But I asked it, why? Because righteousness seemed beyond me. It seemed beyond me. And it seemed beyond the people Jesus was talking with. Do you know that righteousness for them was a whole list of things that you had to do on the Sabbath? But the trouble was that most of the people, the common people, were ignorant, unaware, did not know what they were supposed to do on the Sabbath. Because you had to be a scholar to know. And so on the Sabbath, they kept making mistakes and told they were unclean. Did you know that if you had a withered hand in that day and time, it meant you could not possibly be righteous because you were deformed? And if you were deformed, you weren't allowed in the temple? And if you're deformed, it's because God has punished you for some sin in your life. That's what they believed in those days and times. So you could be born with a withered hand, and there's no possible way you could be righteous. If you were poor and could not afford to buy the sacrifices that were needed to give God God's honor in the temple, if you couldn't afford that, you could not possibly be righteous. This was the burden they were under. But the word righteousness, dikaiosune, is an interesting word. It doesn't just mean personal righteousness. It also means group righteousness. And the people in that day and time sat out there listening to those, Jesus said, those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. And they could have thought that might have meant not only personal righteousness, which they were failing at miserably, but also they wanted justice in the world. And they weren't getting it. The Romans were stronger than ever. They were being neglected. And there it was, ever out of reach. But there's good news. Jesus turns everything upside down. And he said, "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled." Which I take to mean then that this is possible. It's possible. Or Jesus wouldn't have said it. It's possible to be righteous. Now, you know John Wesley, the founder of the English-speaking side of the United Methodist Church, who lived in the 1700s. He said that you could be perfect in love in this life. Perfect in love in this life. Now, when he used the word perfect, he meant complete, all right? Whole, not without error. In fact, he went on to explain it. He said you could not be without error in this life. You will make mistakes. He called that unintentional sin. And he would say none of us could be rid of unintentional sin in this lifetime because of just the fact that we're human and a part of fallen creation. So I know what he means. Have you ever offended somebody and you didn't mean to? Haven't we done that? I didn't even know they were going to take it that way. I look at the way it came out and what they said, and then I realize, oh, I didn't mean to do that. I still apologize for it, don't I? Sorry, I didn't mean to say that. One time my mother said this. This was a terrible thing. She said, "Oh, Mark, you got good grades. You're almost in your brother's category." She offended him, didn't she? And really, it sort of offended me. No, Mom. Mark's good because Mark's good. No comparison to John is needed. Do you see what we do? We mess up. It's unintentional. It's unintentional. Just comes out. But Wesley believed we could so travel with Jesus over a lifetime that we could get to the place where we might be perfect in love. That is, we no longer intentionally sin. Intentionally sin. Which means then this, you insult me and I just want to bring you down. And I insult you. Intentional. No. Wesley would say, we're to love our enemies. We're to pray for them. Right out of the scriptures. So, here we are. We're a people who hunger and thirst for righteousness. It must be possible. Do you know who the Hebrews lifted up as being the most righteous person of all? Do you know that? Besides God. Do you know who the most righteous person was? Abraham. Do you know that? Abraham. He is the father of the Hebrew nation. Now, some people think he was righteous because of that time when God tested him. You remember God tested him and said, I want you to take your son, your only son, take him to the mountain. I want you to kill him and offer him as a sacrifice, which was something only the pagans did. And yet Abraham heard God's voice, knew it was God's voice, and decided he'd go through with it. And he raised the knife, and you remember what happened? God provided a sacrifice and says, you don't have to do this. Now, some people think that he was righteous because of that event. But that's not what Scripture says. In the book of Genesis, in the 15th chapter, the 6th verse, it says this: Abraham believed the Lord, and the Lord reckoned it to him as righteousness. And this was right at the beginning of the covenant. God took Abraham outside, showed him the stars, and here's what I know. There were a whole lot more stars you could see then than you can see now. All right? Whole lot more. Looked at all those stars and said, I will make of you a great nation. Your descendants will be as numerous as the stars. I will be your God, and you will be my people. And Abraham believed the Lord, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness. So maybe Einstein had it wrong. Remember, he said, this isn't a matter of trust. Maybe it is. It's a matter of trust. Abraham believed the Lord, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness. Maybe it's more important to trust in God's actions than to look to our own. That God's the actor. In fact, look at Jesus Christ. He came and acted on our behalf. He took all our sin upon himself, didn't he? And then he gave us the gift of righteousness and salvation.